Welcome ladies and gentlemen to the second episode of Tech Query Build Advice, where I'll be going over my thoughts on your guys' builds. And with that, let's get right into our video. User airplanefartbandit, nice username, says, first build I've done by myself. I'd love a little feedback on parts before I pull the trigger. I'm putting this bad boy together mostly for video editing, but we'll do a little gaming with it too. I'm not fussed about how it looks, definitely far more focused on getting the best value in terms of quality and cost. I'm in Australia and can get all the parts for just under 4k Australian dollars, but I have a little wiggle room cost-wise if you can think of any ways to improve the functionality. For our CPU, user airplanefartbandit has gone with the AMD Ryzen 9 5950X. For their cooler, they've gone with the Noctua NH-U12A. For their motherboard, an ASUS ROG Strix B550F Gaming. For memory, 4 sticks of 8GB of G.Skill Ripjaws V that run at 4000 MHz per second DDR4. For their storage, they've actually gone with a 1-2 punch kind of style here, with a 2TB Samsung 970 EVO Plus M.2 NVMe SSD along with a 10TB WD Red Plus NAS hard drive. For their GPU, they've gone with an ASUS TUF Gaming GeForce RTX 3080 AUSSIE version 2. For their case, they have a Fractal Design Meshify C. For their power supply, a Corsair RM850W. And for their operating system, Windows 10 Home. This entire build comes out to around 3,997 Australian dollars. Now, all in all, this build actually looks great for a little bit of video editing. You've got all those nice CPU cores, and that 10GB 3080 should more than do the trick in terms of any kind of light gaming. Now there is a little bit of wiggle room in terms of the parts here. The user could save $90 here by going with the Be Quiet Dark Rock 4, which should give comparable performance to the Noctua NH-U12A in terms of cooling performance. And again, it's only 109 Australian dollars according to PC Part Picker, so a lot of savings in that department. However, Be Quiet does list on their page that the Dark Rock 4 can overlap with the first RAM slot even with very flat memory modules. Seeing as how the user has gone for 4 sticks of RAM, there's a choice that needs to be made here. The user can either instead opt to go with 2 sticks of RAM and make the Be Quiet Dark Rock 4 work, or they can instead choose to just stick with the NH-U12A, which boasts 100% compatibility with all RAM sticks due to its asymmetrical design. If, however, the user wants to spring for a bit of a beefier cooler, which is not necessary but is definitely possible if they want to keep their CPU at lower temperatures and lower noise levels, the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4 or the Noctua NH-D15 Chromax Black, both of which strangely come in at a lower price point than the NH-U12A that they listed here, are all great alternatives. Both of these should perform much better than the NH-U12A at keeping the monster of a CPU that the user chose here very cool. As for RAM clearance, the G.Skill Ripjaws V series of RAM sticks have a module height of 42mm. Now this does require a little bit of tinkering with these massive dual tower heatsinks. For instance, the Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro 4 actually only accommodates 40mm of clearance in the front with the fan attached. However, it is possible to move the fan a little bit upwards. Additionally, you could technically remove the fan entirely, giving you 46.8mm of clearance. However, this can lead to reduced cooling performance overall. Similarly, the Noctua NH-D15 has only 32mm of clearance with the front fan installed. Again, you could just move the fan up or just remove it entirely, but both of these can, of course, result in decreased cooling performance. It's also important to remember that by moving the fan up, you also need to be careful about case compatibility and the maximum CPU cooler height that each case supports. In the case of the Fractal Meshify C that the user here chose, the maximum CPU cooler height is 170mm. So the user won't exactly have too much flexibility to work with in terms of moving the cooler up. Now for their motherboard, they can go with the MSI B550A Pro ATX motherboard. Yes, technically the Strix motherboard has beefier heatsinks which of course are gonna correspond with lower VRM temperatures, and yes, the Strix board may have much more I/O ports, but the MSI B558 Pro still has a decent number of I/O ports, and still keeps its VRM temperatures reasonably in check, as can be seen by this hardware unboxed video. It's also important to note that the MSI motherboard comes in almost $80 cheaper than the Strix motherboard, which is a pretty large cost saving. As for the RAM, even with a high-end motherboard maintaining 4000 MHz RAM speeds on all 4 sticks with Ryzen CPUs, including the Ryzen 5000 series, can be really tricky, and I'll have more on that later. Personally, I would just recommend going with a 3600 or even a 3200 MHz kit of the same capacity, especially as you most likely won't really be seeing a performance difference with any of those 3 speeds. The slower speeds are of course going to add up to yet another cost saving that they can put into another component. Quick side note, the user can also choose to go for 2 sticks of 16GB kits rather than 4 sticks of 8GB kits, because 2 sticks of 16GB kits typically come in a little bit cheaper. By going with 2 sticks, they can also remove any worries of RAM height clearance in terms of CPU coolers. With our case here is where we can spend a little bit more money. The Fractal Design Meshify C is a decent case with decent airflow, but the Fractal Design Meshify 2 Compact has come out, which has been specifically engineered to be an improvement over the original Fractal Design Meshify C, and as can be seen by this Gamers Nexus video, the sequel is a huge improvement. You're getting one more included intake fan, more drive mounts, better GPU and power supply compatibility, one more USB Type-C port, and just better overall airflow. What's not to like in this update? Some other alternatives that are around the same price class as the Fractal Design Meshify 2 Compact include the Corsair 4000D Airflow and the NZXT H510 Flow, both of which are mid-tower ATX cases with great airflow. Just like the case, I thought we could spend a little bit more on the user's power supply here. Technically, the 850 watt power supply should be fine, but if they want to be absolutely safe, they can also go with a good quality 1000 watt power supply. Maybe the Corsair RMX 1000 watt 80 plus gold power supply here. It is a little bit more money, but it should provide them with a lot more flexibility, especially if they want to either overclock their CPU or GPU, or even upgrade to higher end components in the future. This is definitely not a bad idea, especially seeing as how all the recent rumors around new hardware generations like the Intel 13th Gen, AMD Zen 4, and Nvidia 4000 series all are rumored to have increasingly high power draws. In a follow-up comment, airplanefartbandit, I'm never getting old of that name, said, "Thanks a bunch for having a look. With the cooler, someone else has recommended the Deepcool AK620, which seems comparable, if not better than even the NHD15, as well as much cheaper, which seems weird to me. I don't really understand much about coolers, so what's your thinking on that? And why does the Ryzen 5000 struggle to maintain the higher RAM speed? I'm more than happy to go with the 3600 considering the minimal drop in performance but better cost. I'm just curious more than anything, haha. And thanks for the video on that case. That's really interesting. I reckon I'll look into it more, but thinking I'll go with the Corsair 4000D. And I like the idea for going to 1000 watt for the power supply. With a few of your suggestions and some other people, I've shaved a bit off cost, so I think this might be somewhere worth putting it back in. But again, I really appreciate you taking the time to give it a look over. And to that, I say no problem. But anyways, let's get right into answering their follow-up. Our Lord and Savior Tech Jesus, also known as Gamers Nexus, actually made a review on the Deepcool AK620, showing it to be an extremely capable budget air cooler. In fact, the AK620 was shown to go toe-to-toe, that rhymes, toe-to-toe, and sometimes even beating the Noctua NHD15, the Scythe Fuma 2, and the Deepcool Assassin 3, all of which are amazing coolers. And as a quick note, the AK620 also has 43mm of clearance for RAM, which should make it compatible with the G-Skill Ripjaws that this user has chosen to go for. So then, what gives? How is this cooler cheaper than others? Well, for instance, companies can cheap out on other components that don't necessarily affect the cooling performance. For instance, Deepcool has gone with a bit of a simpler packaging design for this cooler. You'll also notice that there's no fancy paint job like any of the black coolers that we saw earlier, so they can definitely save a little bit of money there. But overall, if Airplane Fart Bandit doesn't mind going with that chrome look, I would definitely recommend it. Another great cheap alternative air cooler that competes at a very similar level is the Scythe Fuma 2, which is also very well reviewed by Gamers Nexus. The second question is a little bit more complicated and technical, and I may have gotten some information wrong, so please bear with me, and if you find that I either have any of my information wrong, or you think that other viewers can stand to benefit from additional information, feel free to add it down below in the comments. So, Ryzen CPUs in general can struggle to maintain a RAM speed higher than 4000 MHz because of something called the Infinity Fabric Clock, which you'll see abbreviated online frequently as FCLK. Others of you in the comments can, of course, provide a more in-depth technical explanation, but essentially, the Infinity Fabric serves as the architecture connecting the CPU to the memory controller as well as other things. For optimal performance, it's actually best to keep your F clock at a 1:1:1 ratio with your Unified Memory Controller Clock, also known as UCLK, and Memory Clock, MEMCLK, also known as MEM clock, meaning that your F clock should always be exactly half of your RAM clock. Now, they don't have to worry about managing all of this because it should automatically be done for you. Although technically the Ryzen 5000 series processor's F-clock can be overclocked to 2000 MHz, therefore allowing it to support 4000 MHz RAM at a 1:1:1 ratio, it can be very tricky to maintain, so most people suggest going only up to 1800 MHz on their F-clock instead, and going with 3600 MHz RAM. Going with anything higher can cause the ratio between their F-clock and memory clock to go up to 2:1, which introduces very heavy latency and therefore lower performance. And they've gone with some nice thinking for their power supply. A quick word on the Corsair 4000D, however. The 4000D only comes with two 120mm fans, one as intake and one as exhaust. With these kinds of high-end components, it can be very difficult to keep everything cool with only two fans. There is an option available for a 5-pack of 120mm fans from Arctic that only comes in at 45 Australian dollars that I think would be a great addition to those two fans that are pre-included in the case. All in all, at the end of the day, if the user decides to implement some of the aforementioned changes, we come out to total a little over $200 less, and that's including a larger wattage power supply, an objectively better air cooler, and more fans for our case. Not to mention, a case that's much better built for airflow. That frees up a lot more money to allow the user to tackle things like software for their video editing, more games, or just general money. I honestly think we did pretty well given our $4K budget. So I hope user Airplane Fart Bandit is satisfied with those changes, and that just about wraps it up for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and check out my last few videos where I answered your hardware questions. You might also enjoy some of my other upcoming episodes where I'll be covering similar build lists like the ones in this video, so be sure to get subscribed for that. See you all in the next one!